Evan Ramirez had lived in the neighborhood for 3 years, and in all that time he kept mostly to himself. He wasn't unfriendly, just quiet, the kind of person who waved politely but didn't linger for long talks. He worked long shifts, sometimes overnight, and preferred a calm home life when he finally got the chance to rest. His small townhouse sat at the end of a row, shaded by 2 tall trees that rustled in even the slightest breeze. From the outside, he looked like any regular resident trying to get through the week. The community was peaceful, for the most part, the well-trimmed lawns and neatly painted homes. But the Homeowners Association was strict, especially with a president who took her job more seriously than most people took their careers. Margaret Litton, who some neighbors whispered about as being overly intense, was known for writing violation notices over the smallest things, a trash bin left out too long, a faded welcome mat, or even a wind chime she claimed was excessively reflective. Evan had managed to stave off her radar until the day she noticed his Jeep. The Jeep wasn't flashy or loud. It was a plain dark gray Wrangler with rugged tires, a bit taller than usual, and fitted with equipment that didn't stand out to the untrained eye. But to someone like Margaret, who believed every detail of the neighborhood mattered, it was something she felt the need to question. She had seen it parked in the open guest lot one morning and immediately decided it didn't match what she called the community aesthetic. Evan didn't think anything of it at first. To him, the Jeep was work equipment, something he used as part of a law enforcement task force that required him to keep certain gear inside. He didn't talk about his job, not because it was secret, but because he didn't like drawing attention to himself. The Jeep just happened to be part of the work he had chosen. He kept it maintained, clean, and legally parked. There was nothing unusual about it, but a week after Margaret first spotted it, Evan came home to a bright orange slip shoved into the crack of his front door. It was a notice from the HOA. He read it twice, confused. According to Margaret, the Jeep violated several community guidelines: improper visibility, excessive height, and suspicious attachments. Evan almost laughed at that last one. The attachments were standard equipment his team used, and nothing about them was illegal. He sighed, folded the notice, and placed it on his kitchen counter. His instinct told him this wasn't going to be the last message he received. The next morning, he walked outside to head to work, and sure enough, there she was. Margaret stood near the sidewalk, arms crossed tightly, watching him like she expected him to break some rule just by stepping outside. She wasn't unfriendly in a traditional sense, but her expression always looked like she was judging something. "Good morning," he said, trying to keep things simple. She didn't smile. "I trust you saw the notice," she said. "I did," he replied. "But my vehicle is within the legal limits and allowed by state law. There shouldn't be any issues." Margaret tilted her head, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "This neighborhood has standards. We maintain a certain look here, and your Jeep doesn't exactly fit. It draws attention. People have asked questions." Evan doubted that, but he wasn't interested in starting an argument. He simply nodded and locked his front door. "I'll make sure everything is compliant." That wasn't good enough for her, but he didn't stick around to hear the rest of whatever she wanted to say. He walked to the Jeep, started the engine, and drove off. At work, mentioned the notice to one of his teammates, who chuckled and said, "Man, these HOA people have too much free time. Just keep the papers. You never know when you'll need them." So he did. Over the next few days, more notices appeared, some taped to his door, others stuck under his windshield wiper. Each one claimed different issues, none of which held any real merit. Evan began keeping a folder for them, not because he cared about the HOA rules, but because he knew people like Margaret didn't stop easily. Eventually, he tried to avoid the conflict altogether. He started storing the Jeep inside his assigned garage space, even though it made things more complicated for him. The garage was narrow, and parking the Jeep inside meant he had to be careful not to hit anything. But if it kept Margaret from writing him up every 2 days, he was willing to deal with it. For a while, it worked. The notices stopped. Evan felt a small wave of relief every time he came home from a long shift and didn't see another orange slip waiting for him. Maybe, he thought, she had moved on to something else, but Margaret was not someone who moved on easily. One evening, after returning home late, Evan noticed something unusual as he walked toward the row of garages. The metal door to his unit, which he always made sure to lock, was slightly crooked on its track, like someone had tried to lift it without fully knowing how. He paused and looked closer. There were faint scratches near the lock, fresh enough that the metal still had tiny curls around the edges. Evan felt a cold sensation in his stomach. He pulled the door open and checked the Jeep. Everything inside seemed in place. But the discovery wasn't something he could ignore. He didn't call the police, he technically worked with them. And he knew the process. Instead, he contacted his task force supervisor, explaining what he had seen. The supervisor didn't sound surprised. "Could be random tampering," supervisor said. "But given your neighborhood issues, keep an eye on it. Make sure the security devices are active. If anything else happens, let us know right away." Evan agreed. After the call, he stood in the dim garage for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the lights overhead. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been trying to get into the Jeep, not just the garage. And he had a suspicion about who might be bold enough to try. The next day confirmed that suspicion. As he stepped outside in the morning, he found Margaret standing near the row of mailboxes, clipboard in hand. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and barely hidden disapproval. "Your vehicle isn't supposed to be stored in the garage without approval," she said as soon as he walked closer. He raised an eyebrow. "There's no rule against parking in my own garage." "There are guidelines," she insisted. "There are no guidelines about that," he replied calmly. She pressed her lips into a thin line. Clearly frustrated that he wasn't reacting the way she wanted, she scribbled something on her clipboard, snapped it shut, and stormed off. Evan watched her go, already sensing that this situation was slowly turning into something much bigger than a disagreement over parking. That evening, after work, he double-checked the garage door, reinforced the lock, and made sure the Jeep's security system was active. He didn't like being suspicious. The experience had taught him to trust his instincts. He stood there for a moment, staring at the scratch marks on the metal. Something told him Margaret wasn't done, and the more she fixated on his Jeep, the more he felt that something unusual and probably messy was about to happen. He didn't know how right he was. The trouble hadn't even started yet for a while. Things around the neighborhood seemed calm again, at least from the outside. Evan tried to go about his days as normally as possible, keeping his focus on work and keeping his Jeep tucked safely in the garage. The odd feeling that someone had tried to break in lingered in the back of his mind. But nothing new happened during the first week. And with how often his job required him to stay alert, he learned to push small worries aside. Still, he couldn't ignore how Margaret always seemed to be nearby whenever he stepped outside. She was never subtle about it. She had a habit of appearing out of nowhere, holding that same clipboard, like she was checking on the entire world. She'd look over the lawns, the fences, the quiet streets, then always end up staring at Evan's townhouse like she expected him to do something wrong. Evan didn't want trouble. He worked long hours and didn't have the energy for a feud. But each day, Margaret's attention became more obvious and more unsettling. One morning, after a long overnight shift, Evan came home hoping to get a few hours of sleep. But as soon as he stepped out of his Jeep, he heard the snapping sound of a phone camera. He turned and saw Margaret standing near a tree, holding her phone in front of her face. She didn't even try to hide what she was doing. "Can I help you?" he asked, too tired to pretend he didn't notice. "I'm documenting," she replied firmly. "Residents have expressed concerns. Your vehicle has unusual features. It's only fair that the board has a complete record." Evan looked at her for a long moment. "There's nothing wrong with my vehicle." "I've already explained that." "You've explained nothing to me," she said sharply. "You refuse to discuss it. You keep secrets. That concerns me." "It concerns all of us." Evan didn't bother to reply. He walked inside without giving her another glance. He knew trying to reason with someone who already believed their own ideas was a waste of energy. He locked his door, closed the blinds, and tried to rest. But the uneasy feeling stayed with him. Over the next few days, the situation slowly got stranger. Neighbors began acting differently. Some avoided eye contact. Some gave polite nods but looked uncomfortable afterward. A few even glanced toward his garage before quickly looking away. Evan didn't want to assume things, but he had a strong suspicion that Margaret had been talking about him. She had a talent for creating drama where there wasn't any, and she liked to speak confidently enough that people believed her. Before checking the facts, by the end of the week, he found another notice taped to his front door. This one wasn't a violation slip but a list of community concerns handwritten in Margaret's tidy. Sharp lettering, the paper claimed that his Jeep was military grade. The dark tint made it unsafe for the neighborhood. The antenna equipment was suspicious. A few residents were uncomfortable with it. Evan sighed as he read it. He knew the Jeep had equipment that wasn't common on regular cars, but nothing about it was illegal or dangerous. Still, he folded the note and placed it in the same folder where he kept the others. Something told him this wasn't just about the Jeep anymore. Margaret had decided he was a problem. She wanted to prove herself right. Later that afternoon, Evan took a short walk around the block to get some air. As he passed the community park, he noticed two neighbors sitting on a bench talking while glancing in his direction. When he walked by, their conversation fell silent. "Evening," he said politely. They both nodded but didn't say anything. Their eyes went straight to the parking area behind him, where the garage rows were located. Evan knew then that Margaret was spreading stories. That evening, he pulled the Jeep halfway out of his garage to load some equipment he needed for the night shift. He kept the garage light on to see better, and while he worked, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned and saw Margaret standing several feet away, hands clasped behind her back. "You have a lot of gear in there," she said. "Most people don't keep that kind of equipment at home." Evan wiped his hands on a cloth and stood up straight. "It's job-related." "What job requires all of that?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. His role allowed him to keep the Jeep and equipment at home, and he was allowed to decline details when asked. Still, he tried to be respectful. "I assist with public safety," he said simply. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Public safety? So you're some kind of private investigator? Or something else?" "Nothing dramatic," he replied. "Just work. Nothing to worry about." Her eyes narrowed. "People don't bring that level of equipment to their homes unless they're hiding something." Evan felt a small wave of frustration, but he didn't let it show. "There's nothing hidden here. Everything I do is within the law." She looked past him into the garage. "I could call for a board inspection. Garages are technically part of the community property rules." "That's not how it works," he said calmly. She crossed her arms. "We'll see." Then she walked away. Evan stood there for a moment before returning to what he was doing. He didn't want to engage with her any further, but it was getting harder to ignore how determined she was becoming. The next morning, after another late shift, Evan came home and found a group of people standing near the mailboxes. They were talking quietly, and when they noticed him, they paused. One of them, a man from 2 houses down, muttered something under his breath. Evan didn't confront them. He simply grabbed his mail and went home. But something told him that Margaret had been planting ideas in their heads, inside his home. Evan sat at his counter with a cup of coffee, trying to organize his thoughts. He wasn't angry, but he was tired from work, tired from dealing with the constant attention, tired from feeling like he was being watched. He pulled out the folder again and went through the papers. It was thick now, filled with every notice Margaret had posted on his door or windshield. Most of them had no real logic behind them. They were just complaints she had written whenever she had nothing else to focus on. He set the folder aside and rubbed his eyes. He needed a plan. He couldn't continue letting her escalate things, so that afternoon, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood and check if anything else seemed unusual. He didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. But as he approached the parking area behind the community garden, he noticed something that made him stop. Margaret was there. She was bent over someone's car with her phone out, taking close-up pictures of a small scratch on the bumper. The owner of the car, a young couple who lived a few units down, stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. They kept trying to tell her the scratch didn't matter, but she insisted it was a violation of the community's appearance rules. Evan watched quietly for a moment. The couple exchanged looks that made it clear they didn't know how to get rid of her. He walked over and greeted them politely. The couple looked relieved when they saw him. "Is everything okay?" Evan asked. Margaret straightened up. "This vehicle has damage that affects the visual harmony of the neighborhood," she declared. "It's a small scratch," Evan said, looking at it. "Barely noticeable." "It is noticeable to me," she replied. "And if I notice it, others will too." The couple looked exhausted by the situation. Evan decided not to argue. It wasn't his place to step into someone else's issue. Still, seeing Margaret act this way towards someone who clearly didn't want her involvement made him understand something. It's important. This wasn't about him. This was about control. About her feeling powerful. About her believing she had authority over everyone. He walked away slowly, leaving the couple to explain again that they didn't want her help. But in his mind, he could already see where things were heading. Margaret had made the Jeep her new obsession, and when someone like her focused on something, they didn't just let it go. They pushed. They escalated. They convinced themselves they were right, even when every fact said otherwise. That evening, while Evan checked the Jeep's equipment before leaving for work, he felt a strange heaviness in the air. He didn't know when it would happen, but he knew one thing for sure. Margaret wasn't done. Her fixation on his vehicle had just started, and he sensed something bigger was coming. Something that would drag the whole neighborhood into a situation none of them asked for. He closed the garage door gently, locked it, and headed to work with the uneasy feeling that the calm days were gone for good. The night everything began to unravel slowly at first. Almost quietly, the way small storms begin, long before anyone realizes a bigger one is forming. Evan didn't know it then, but that week would become the turning point. The moment when Margaret's curiosity crossed the line into something far more serious. It started on a Wednesday evening. Evan came home later than usual after a long shift, parking his Jeep inside the garage as he always did. He was tired but not exhausted, and for once, he felt like he might get a full night of rest. He locked the garage, double-checked the door, and headed inside. Nothing seemed out of place. The neighborhood was calm, the streetlights buzzing softly. The air carried the faint smell of fresh-cut grass from a house down the road. Evan made dinner, relaxed on the couch for a bit, and finally went to bed. But around midnight, a small noise woke him. It wasn't loud not enough to startle someone. It wasn't already used to listening for small shifts in the environment. But Evan's work had trained him to respond to even the faintest sound. He sat up, listening carefully. There it was again, a scraping noise. It came from outside. Near the row of garages, Evan got out of bed slowly. He didn't panic, and he didn't rush. Instead, he walked toward the living room window and gently pulled one part of the curtain back. He squinted into the darkness, trying to see through the shadows. Nothing but the noise continued, a quiet metallic grinding sound. He stepped away from the window and stood still, thinking. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something inside him whispered that this wasn't random. Someone was messing with his garage again. He grabbed a jacket and slipped on shoes. He didn't turn on any outside lights because he didn't want whoever was out there to know he was awake. Instead, he opened the front door slowly and stepped outside. The night air was cool and heavy. Everything around him was silent, except for that faint metal scraping. Walked quietly toward the garages. That's when he saw a shadow move. Someone was kneeling in front of his garage door. Evan didn't breathe for a second. He didn't want to startle the person. He needed to understand what was happening before he reacted. As he took another step forward, the motion sensor light in the alley clicked on, casting a pale glow over the row of garages, and there, crouched in front of his unit, was Margaret. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a determined expression on her face. In her hands was a pair of bolt cutters, large, silver, and completely out of place in a peaceful neighborhood. Evan stared for a moment, stunned, not by the sight of her, but by how calm she looked while breaking into someone else's property. Margaret didn't hear him yet. She was focused, struggling to cut through the heavy-duty lock he installed. She grunted softly as she pressed down on the handles. The lock was thick, and she was having trouble breaking it. Evan finally spoke. Margaret. The sound of her name made her freeze. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Her expression wasn't fear or embarrassment. It was annoyance. Oh, she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. You're awake. Why are you cutting my lock? Evan asked. He kept his voice calm, even though his heart was racing. She straightened up and let the bolt cutters hang at her side. I'm doing my job, she replied. I have reason to believe something in this garage violates community safety rules. Evan stared at her. You can't break into someone's garage because of a rule. I can when someone refuses to cooperate, she said sharply. I've asked you multiple times to explain what's inside this vehicle. You continue to ignore me. I can't allow suspicious equipment in a neighborhood with families. Evan's jaw tightened. There is nothing dangerous in that garage. Say that, she replied, lifting her chin. But you refuse to show anyone what's inside. You keep secrets. You hide things. That puts the entire community at risk. Evan took a slow breath. You need to stop. Put the bolt cutters down. Instead, she gripped them tighter. I'm opening it, she said. The community has a right to know what you're keeping here. It's not your decision, Evan said. It is, she insisted. I'm the HOA president. I have full authority. No, he replied calmly. You don't. Not like this. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and her tone shifted from frustrated to almost triumphant. I already posted a notice for a mandatory inspection. You ignored it. That gives me the right to enter. Evan shook his head. You posted a handwritten note that wasn't legally valid. It doesn't matter, she snapped. I'm protecting this community. Before Evan could respond, she pushed down on the bolt cutters again with all her strength. The metal bent slightly, then snapped. The sound was sharp. Echoing down the alley, Margaret dropped the bolt cutters and grabbed the broken lock triumphantly. There. Now we can see what you're hiding. She pulled up the garage door. The Jeep sat inside. Still and harmless, but filled with gear she clearly didn't understand radio equipment. USB mounts, protective cases, radio cables, and other tools used for field operations? Margaret's face went pale. What is all this? She whispered. Equipment for work, Evan replied. What kind of work needs devices like these? She asked, stepping closer to the Jeep. Don't touch anything, Evan warned. But Margaret didn't listen. She reached out and grabbed one of the radio cords, pulling it slightly to inspect it. She looked at the dashboard, which had a secured mount for encrypted devices. Her eyes widened like she thought she'd just uncovered some kind of scandal. This is serious equipment, she said. This doesn't belong here. This looks like something someone dangerous would use. It belongs to a task force, Evan said calmly. Law enforcement authorized? Act. Law enforcement? Yes, Evan said. Everything inside that Jeep is legal and authorized. I've told you before it's part of my job. She looked from him to the Jeep, then back again. You're lying. Why would I lie about that? He asked. Because it sounds unbelievable, she said. Why would someone like you work with law enforcement? Evan blinked. What do you mean someone like me? She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back from the Jeep, examining everything with wide eyes. This equipment is not allowed in a residential area, she declared. I need to photograph it and report it. No, Evan said firmly. You've already crossed the line. I'm doing what's right, she insisted. Before he could stop her, Margaret took out her phone and began snapping pictures. She leaned into the garage, taking photos of the Jeep's interior, the equipment, and even the identification number etched on some of the devices. Margaret, stop. You can't tell me to stop, she snapped. I'm documenting everything. And tomorrow morning, the board will meet. And we will decide what to do about this. She stopped mid-sentence. Because in that moment, a sharp beeping sound came from inside the Jeep. A small red light began. Flashing, Evan's stomach dropped. The Jeep had a tamper alert system. A system connected directly to his unit. And that alert meant one thing. Authorities were already on their way. Margaret paused. What was that? Evan didn't answer. Instead, he heard the distant sound of engines approaching. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and controlled. Margaret turned toward the street, confused. Who would be driving around at this hour? Evan knew, and in a few seconds so would she. Margaret backed away from the Jeep, her confidence finally cracking as she looked around nervously. What's going on? Why are there cars coming? She asked. Evan didn't have to say anything. The headlights appeared at the end of the alley, two unmarked vehicles, slow, silent, steady. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, and in that moment, she realized that the situation she thought she controlled was about to slip completely out of her hands. The news about the Jeep spread through the community faster than anyone expected, and the whole place felt strange in the days after the officers returned it. It wasn't only the flashing lights or the police tape or the sudden quiet that followed. It was the feeling that something hidden had been dragged out into the open, something that had been building for a long time. People whispered in driveways, spoke softly over fences, and looked around before they talked, as if the sky itself was listening. For the person living in the townhouse closest to the storage lot, sleep didn't come easily anymore. Every time a car door shut outside, they jolted up, expecting to see officers again, or the HOA president marching around with that same clipped, irritated stride she always had. Even though the officers explained that nothing illegal had been done by the Jeep's owner, the whole situation still felt tense. Too many things were happening that were never talked about, a string of misplaced notices, complaints that didn't make sense, rules enforced on some people and ignored for others. One quiet afternoon, the owner of the Jeep sat on their porch trying to settle their thoughts. The air smelled like cut grass, and kids were riding small bikes in slow circles near the cul-de-sac. Everything looked normal, almost peaceful. But their mind was still replaying the moment when the officers showed the cut lock and the broken latch. No matter how many times they tried to shrug it off, the feeling lingered that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. A neighbor walked over with a cautious look, as if unsure whether to speak. They held a mug with steam curling from it, and their eyes flicked around before they leaned slightly closer. I wasn't going to say anything before, the neighbor said quietly, but I saw her the day it happened. She wasn't even trying to hide it. She marched right over like she owned the whole place. They shook their head with a tired laugh. It was strange. I thought maybe she had a reason, but after everything that happened, I guess not. Hearing it again from someone else didn't make the situation feel better. It only confirmed a truth that had already been sitting heavy. In the back of the Jeep owner's mind, she didn't act out of misunderstanding. She acted out of entitlement, maybe even spite. Another neighbor joined them, holding a folded grocery bag from a walk back home. They lowered their voice. A lot of us have had trouble with her. She'll find someone for leaving a flower pot near the walkway. Another person got a warning for parking slightly crooked. It feels like she's looking for problems. The Jeep owner listened quietly, not wanting to push for more details, but sensing that people were finally willing to talk. Sometimes it takes something big, something impossible to ignore for people to break their silence. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People who rarely spoke before now exchanged small nods of understanding. Gated communities were supposed to feel safe, but this one felt unsettled, like the illusion of control had cracked. And everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. A few days later, the Jeep owner received a message from the HOA office. The tone was curt, as always. The words felt painfully familiar. Please attend an urgent meeting regarding the recent security matter. No explanation, no apology, just a demand. They stared at the screen for a long moment, unsure whether to laugh or sigh. After everything that happened, now the HOA wanted a meeting. The idea of sitting across the table from the same person who cut their lock didn't sit well, but avoiding it would only give her more fuel. So they decided to go, hoping at the very least to hear some kind of reasoning, if she even had one. The meeting room inside the small HOA building was stiff and overly bright. The long table in the center looked like something from a budget office, and the chairs squeaked whenever someone shifted. A few board members sat scattered around the table. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and one seemed like they wished they were anywhere else. The HOA president sat at the far end, her back straight, fingers laced together. Her expression was tight, the same practiced look of authority she wore at every meeting. But this time, something was different. There was a flicker of tension in her eyes, a tiny crack in the confidence she usually carried. "Thank you for coming," she began. The words were polite, but the tone wasn't. "We need to discuss the matter involving your vehicle. There have been concerns raised about the way it was stored." The Jeep owner waited a moment, letting the silence hang there. It felt important not to rush into anything, especially after everything that had happened. "My lock was cut," they said calmly. "My property was opened without permission. And you filed a complaint accusing me of violating a rule that doesn't even apply to the storage lot." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. The president's lips pressed together. "I acted based on the information I had," she replied. "There were reports of a suspicious vehicle. As the HOA president, I have the authority to investigate." "Investigate?" The Jeep owner kept their voice steady. "There's a difference between checking on something and breaking into it. And you didn't even ask. You didn't send a notice. You didn't call. You just broke the lock and opened it." One of the board members cleared their throat hesitantly. "To be fair, we were not aware of the full extent of what happened. We weren't informed that a lock had been cut. We thought this was about improper storage." Another one added, "We didn't know law enforcement was involved until after the officers showed up." They looked at the president briefly. "That part wasn't shared with us." The room shifted, then subtle, but unmistakable. It became clear that even the members of her own board had been kept in the dark. The president straightened, her voice rising slightly. "This is not a trial. I was doing what I believed was necessary. The vehicle was unmarked. I didn't know it belonged to any official task force." "That's not the point," the Jeep owner said gently but firmly. "Even if it wasn't a task force vehicle, you still damaged property that didn't belong to you. This could have happened to anyone else in this neighborhood." The room grew quiet again. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the trees. It felt like each member of the board was weighing something silently, maybe their own past frustrations, maybe all the things they had ignored because they didn't want conflict. Finally, the board member sitting closest to the door spoke up. "We need to review this properly. We need to look at the rules again. We shouldn't be damaging property unless there's a direct safety issue, and even then, there are steps to follow." Another added, "We also need to be informed of actions taken in our name. If someone acts on behalf of the HOA, we need to know what's being done." The president looked like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. For the first time, she seemed unsure of how much control she still had. The meeting ended with a promise that the situation would be reviewed, and that the board would consider updating procedures to prevent anything similar from happening again. The Jeep owner left with mixed feelings. It wasn't an apology. Not fully. But it was something, a shift, a fracture in the old pattern. Outside, the sky was fading into the soft colors of evening. As they walked toward their home, a couple of neighbors waved from across the parking area. There was no judgment in their eyes, only quiet encouragement. A small but meaningful gesture. Later that night, sitting in the soft glow of a living room lamp, the Jeep owner reflected on how strange the past days had been. It felt surreal. How an ordinary week had turned into a swirl of tension, police lights, and uncomfortable truths. But even through the stress and the uncertainty, one thought stood out clearly. Maybe this was the beginning of something changing. Not quickly, not perfectly, but enough that people felt a little less afraid of speaking up. In the distance, a dog barked and a garage door rumbled shut. The neighborhood hummed with the ordinary sounds of life going on. And for the first time in a while, things felt like they were moving in a better direction. The situation wasn't over. Far from it. There were still questions, still meetings ahead, still conversations that needed to happen, but something important had shifted, and everyone could feel it. The week after the meeting felt strangely quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the type where people walked a little slower, looked a little longer, and waited for the next thing to happen. The Jeep owner tried to go back to normal morning routines. Work, small chores around the house. But their mind kept drifting back to the board members' faces during that meeting and the way their expressions shifted when the truth came. Out there was no official update from the HOA at first. No email, no note, slipped under the door, nothing. It was as if the board needed time to sit with the weight of what had happened. In a way that wasn't surprising. Change in a neighborhood like this rarely came fast. Still, people talked. They talked more openly now, standing in pairs by their mailboxes or chatting during evening walks. And although the Jeep owner didn't try to insert themselves into those conversations, they often overheard whispers. Something has to change. She can't keep doing things like that. We all pay dues. That means all of us deserve a say. For the first time since moving there, the Jeep owner felt less alone. One afternoon, while they were checking the small community garden near the entrance, a neighbor approached. Not someone they had ever spoken to before, just a familiar face from passing cars and morning nods. "I heard what happened," the neighbor said in a gentle voice. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. It's not right." The Jeep owner smiled slightly. "Thank you. I appreciate it. She's been difficult for a long time," the neighbor went on. "A lot of us didn't know what to do about it. But after seeing what happened with your Jeep, well, I think people feel braver about speaking up." That thought stayed with them. Braver. Sometimes it took one moment, one broken lock, one wrong decision to bring years of quiet frustration to the surface. A few days later, a notice finally arrived. It wasn't handwritten or stuffed impatiently into a doorframe. It was properly printed, folded, and slipped respectfully into mailboxes. HOA community-wide meeting. Procedure review and board discussion. Under it was a short line. Attendance encouraged. The Jeep owner held the paper quietly for a moment. Something about that tiny phrase attendance encouraged felt different. More inclusive. More neutral. Almost like someone else had written it. When the evening of the meeting arrived, small community hall filled faster than usual. People who never bothered to attend HOA events came this time. Retired residents, new families, quiet couples from the houses near the back, and even a few teenagers who usually kept to themselves, they all came. Curious, or frustrated, or hopeful, the Jeep owner found a seat near the middle. They didn't want to sit too close to the front where everything felt stiff, but not so far back that they couldn't hear. The board entered together, which was unusual, and the president, normally early and commanding, walked in last. She looked tired, as if the weight of the past week finally caught up to her. One of the board members, a calm and steady person who had spoken up during the previous meeting, cleared their throat and addressed the room. "Thank you all for coming. We know this isn't the usual turnout, and we appreciate everyone taking time to be here. We'd like to discuss updates to our procedures, especially related to property access and communication." People nodded, murmuring softly. The member continued, "We've realized that some actions taken recently did not follow proper process. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. That means reviewing our rules and making adjustments that protect everyone equally." The president shifted slightly but didn't interrupt. The Jeep owner sat quietly, listening. Their heart beat a little faster, not from anger, but from the gravity of seeing something real unfold. Several neighbors raised their hands. One person spoke. "We need clearer notices. Half the time, we don't even know a rule changed." Another added, "No one should be entering or opening someone's property without permission. Ever." A third said carefully, "We pay dues. We deserve transparency about decisions." Every voice felt like another piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Finally. After many people shared their thoughts, the board member looked toward the Jeep owner. "Would you like to say anything?" For a moment, the room went still. The Jeep owner exhaled slowly and stood, not because they wanted attention, but because it felt like the right thing to do. "I don't want to drag this out," they began softly. "But what happened wasn't just about my Jeep or my lock. It showed how easily things can go wrong when communication breaks down. I don't want anyone else to go through something like that. That's all I want, clear rules and fair treatment for everyone." The room nodded. A wave of agreement moving quietly through the crowd. Even the president looked down for a moment. As if absorbing the reality of what her decisions had caused, the board discussed several changes. A requirement for advance notices. Limits on what actions the HOA could take without full board approval. And a community approval process before new restrictions were added. People clapped softly, not in celebration, but in relief. By the time the meeting ended, the evening sky had turned dark. Streetlights flickered on as people walked out in small groups. Talking in soft, hopeful tones, the Jeep owner stepped outside and breathed in the cool night air. The neighborhood felt different, not perfectly fixed, not magically transformed, but lighter, like a knot had finally loosened as they headed back toward their home. The neighbor from earlier approached again. "You did well speaking up," they said. "I just wanted to be honest," the Jeep owner replied. "That's exactly why people listened." They parted ways with a small wave later that night. Sitting in the living room again, the Jeep owner thought about everything that had happened from the moment. The lock was cut to the moment the community spoke together. Maybe for the first time, it wasn't a dramatic ending. No shouting, no big confrontation. Just simple truth and steady voices finally being heard. The Jeep sat safely in its place, lock replaced and untouched. The neighborhood rested under the calm glow of porch lights. And somewhere deep inside, the Jeep owner felt something they hadn't felt since moving there. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing people finally stood up for what was right. And that was enough.